yeah.
Welcome to Freedom Becomes You. This is the podcast and the website where we delve into the intersections between mind-body practice, science, and psychology. I'm delighted to have here with me today Brea Johnson. Hi, Brea.
Hi.
Okay, there you are. Hi. So I'm here with Brea Johnson today of Heart and Bones Yoga, and I've been learning about Brea online. This is actually the first time that we're meeting and talking to one another, which is delightful. And we're on a Facebook group together called Yoga and Movement Research, which has turned out to be an absolute, just a wonderful resource, a real goldmine of people who are, as we're realizing together, forming this loose-knit group that we're kind of jokingly referring to as the Yoga Renaissance. Because there's this nerdy, kind of curious obsession with what the next evolution of yoga posture practice is going to look like as we integrate information from multiple disciplines, as we learn more about anatomy and biomechanics and neurophysiology, all of this juicy, nerdy stuff. And I found that Brea is actually right in a very cool sweet spot with regard to this whole topic that has become a bit of a focus in the last few months. So how would you like to enter into this conversation, Brea? Tell us a little about Heart and Bones Yoga.
Okay. I like the way that you said sweet spot, because that's a word that I use quite a lot for a lot of in a lot of different ways, because it is trying to always find that sweet spot between the movement, the education, the biomechanics, and the anatomy, but without losing the heart of yoga. So for me, that's so much of what Heart and Bones is as a brand name, as a business name. Heart is all the heart transformative stuff about yoga that we all love and got into and have really stayed with over the years, right? And then the bones, to me, is the foundation of understanding of the body, of the movement education. But for me, actually, in a lot of ways, the and in the heart and bones is the magic spot, because that's the thing that puts the two together. And I would even go as far as that's also the community collaboration of all of this too, where I really feel, and I love the way that you describe it as a yoga renaissance, because I think that is what's happening, where we're getting more ideas, we're getting bold. Many of us are being bold enough to make the needed changes, and I hope needed changes within yoga, and I hope without losing the heart of yoga as well. So for me, that's the sweet spot, and that's what Heart and Bones really tries to. What I try to bring, I love the movement. I love, let's talk about your shoulder. Let's talk about what the hip joints need. But let's also not forget about, the heart and the work of the mind and that self-awareness. So my philosophy definitely is, our body is everything. It's everything, right? We can't be in this world without this body. We can't experience, half of what we can without being embodied. But it's not the end all and be all. So it's also the work of the heart, and the work of the heart grounded in the experience of the body. So I feel like that's my big mission in this yoga evolution, is to still impact the practice, to still move it forward, again, without losing the heart of the practice too,
Yeah, I love that. It really goes to one of my favorite words that I've probably overused in the last 20 years, which is integration. And I hear you gesturing. You're actually gesturing towards something really complex and really subtle with this evocative and beautiful kind of poetic name that you're using, Heart and Bones Yoga, because I hear you talking about the intersection between what can be looked at empirically, scientifically, in this case anatomically, and wanting to really honor that and revere that as sacred and understand it as accurately as possible, while at the same time recognizing that all of that is in a deep relationship to the experiential, to the mental, to the emotional, to the aspects of what we are as human beings, that while they're deeply related to all of that body stuff and all of that brain stuff, they have their own process that needs to be honored on its own terms. And how to have an intelligent synthesis of those two domains, I think, is a really, really key question. Because on the one side, you'll have people that just say, no, the body is unimportant, it's an illusion, it's all just pure spirit, right?
You are not this body.
Yeah, you are not your body, and all of that scientific knowledge, all of that mental kind of philosophical penetration, ultimately you're going to have to let that go because it's just about an intuitive kind of heart-centered spiritual journey. And on the other side of the equation, you'll have people who say, well, all of that is basically just bullshit. Let's just talk about what we can, understand empirically through scientific method and push all that other stuff aside. And so what I hear you being concerned about not falling into is a perspective that is so focused on anatomy and biomechanics, shall we say, that there's a kind of pushing aside of the experiential journey.
Yeah, well articulated, absolutely. And here's, it's hard because everybody's so different. Everybody's path is different. We're all at different places in our lives and our causes and conditions. So, we all know that one path, one style, it does not rule them all, just like one cue does not rule them all. Like we human beings, we're all so complex, and then trying to apply a practice like yoga as a cure-all, or like these are the only ways to practice yoga, these are the only ways to move your body, but like it doesn't address the full experience and complexity of life that so in this yoga renaissance where we're reframing the practice, I like to frame it as keeping yoga as a living tradition. So a living tradition is something that we have to all contribute to progress and keep alive. So for me, I think some of the old patterns in yoga where there's that dogmaticness, right? So I think that place of this is the only style, this is the only way, this is the way it's been, so we're not going to change that. That's not serving the complexity of and the variability and variety that is inherent to life and to humanity. And I think this new path of yoga, or this new way of thinking of yoga, is acknowledging that diversity, so that hopefully within all of that, and within, for those who really just want to focus on all the movement, great. For those who want to just focus on spirit, great. For those who want to find that balance between both in their own way, that's perfect. And I really, truly feel that there's a way to do it, but this is what I say, because I teach a lot of teachers too, so I often tell them, like, this is the harder path. What we're talking about right now of, again, going back to that word, the sweet spot. So finding that sweet spot for yourself without having to take, these are the dogmatic principles, so you listen to me, I know what's right for you, but it's actually the harder path going, okay, I'm going to hear, I'm going to listen, I'm going to explore, I'm going to see and integrate all these things to what's right for me.
Yes.
And that's, do you know what I mean? Like, so to me, I find that so challenging for many of us and many teachers going, but it's so much safe if I just follow this style, but I think it takes, as we're in this new space, I think it takes a lot of us being bold enough to do what feels right for us, be open to change and evolution, and know that's part of it. And so to me, that's kind of how I try to synthesize all of that complexity is that.
Yeah, well, I want to come back in a moment to what you were referring to as the heart of yoga and hear a little bit about that for you in terms of how you experience it and how you talk about it. But in what you're saying, I heard you say it's the harder path, right? It's the harder path to stay open to both what your access points are and what you need at different moments in your journey. And stay true to what you're discovering and what you're learning, and stay open to the unfolding process. I think that those of us who are finding common ground in these conversations, we have a kind of temperament that means we've probably changed our minds about quite a few things over the last 5 years, 10 years, and a lot of things over the last 15 or 20 years in terms of what we're doing. And to me, that's incredibly positive, and there's integrity in that, but it is the harder path. And I think that right now, just hearing what you were saying, there are those, and we've seen this with the Yoga and Movement research page on Facebook, there are those who have a really strong reaction against this type of conversation, and what they say is, you shouldn't call it yoga anymore. This is some form of cultural appropriation where you're taking a tradition and then you're distorting it. And usually the argument comes from this place of saying, we know what the true tradition is. We know the way it is supposed to be done. But what I found, because I'm really interested in these topics as well, I'm interested in the history and the philosophy and all of the different lineages, and it's actually incredibly complex, as I'm sure you know. And the more you look into it, the more you find that everyone's been trying to plant their flag in a particular method, in a particular sequence of postures, in a particular set of metaphysical beliefs, in a particular set of ideas about how all of this is supposed to unfold and what the goal is of the practice. And that in fact, all of these different traditions with radically divergent beliefs and methodologies and techniques have been calling themselves yogis. They've been calling what they teach yoga for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And really, the dogmatism or the fundamentalism that you were referencing, it actually has a lot more in common with contemporary branding than I think some of the people on the other side of this debate would like to suggest. That actually it's not that there's a pure original tradition and then there's this commercializing kind of branding process that dilutes or corrupts it. Really, there have always been somewhat entrepreneurial people saying, okay, we have the right way, and only people who do it our way are getting it right. And that's something you can go all the way back and find examples of. So that to me is just really a fascinating, complicated sort of process. And I'm with you. I've been using that term living tradition for a long time as well. And it's actually one of the reasons why I got involved in yoga and in meditation practice, in Buddhism. The idea that we are part of a human inquiry into why we suffer, into how to keep cultivating human flourishing, how to develop clarity of mind, some sort of freedom, a capacity for compassion, relational integrity and ethics, these sorts of things, I think they're innately human, and it's all a big exploration. And I actually find that rigid adherence to any kind of traditional reference points or belief system tends to block that process of inquiry and discovery and really finding out for ourselves. So anyway, that's a little bit longer of a rant than I intended, but it's kind of contextual to what we're talking about.
Oh yeah, and there's so much goodness in there that I should have been writing notes, because there's a couple of different points on that I wanted
to... it's the coffee.
Good. To touch upon. So I think, so for me, the way, because you're like, the complexity of all of this is so crazy, and I think, so one of the points I'll touch upon that you said about that there's that kind of entrepreneurial spirit, right? Mm-hmm. People wanting to plant their flag. I think that's just like humanity, for what it's a power, it's a sense of definition, and it's a sense of safety, I think. And so, so for me, because of the complexity, and I'm not interested in arguing, is something yoga, is this not yoga? Because it's like, I've been on this path long enough that I don't care what other people think. I know what yoga is for me. And which I can answer that in a little bit, what that is. But to me, it's more like, what are the questions underneath the questions? What's the cultural conditioning? That's what I'm so curious about when it comes to these debates about yoga, or when it comes about that constant progression and change, where, I don't blame anybody for feeling more comfortable following a specific set path. Mm-hmm. And what you were saying about how humanity said, we're all just trying to figure this out. We're all trying to live well, and and so I think that's the answer that every religion has been trying to answer. Every system and tradition tries to, that's the heart of all of this. This is why these systems come into play, because there's some unanswerable questions in life, like who are we and why are we here? I have some great ideas about that, but I'm open to knowing that those, we really can't truly know that maybe until we pass on, and I don't think part of our work as humans is just to keep exploring and being creative and curious. And that's, again, going back to that, what I sense is the harder path is that there's a real sense of safety in following a system. So I get it. I get why people would get really protective about their practice or what yoga is.
Yeah.
But it's more like, okay, but we live in a culture, our current Western culture for now, let's say our modern world, is so backwards, is so built upon, it's a patriarchal structure. And as much as women we're finding our space, it's still based in this like dominant hierarchical male based structure that, of course, our yoga practice is no different, right? Some of the traditions, like I think, what I'm trying to say is that we can't take the cultural conditioning away from yoga, from ourselves. We are a product of this. So that's where this, like the sense of the other underneath layer of all of this yoga renaissance, where cool integrated practice, movements, biomechanics, but let's also uncover the cultural conditioning that's in this, that we're all a part of. And can we be skillful enough to continue to question everything with heart and love and through the filter of our own intentions? So, and something else that I want you to pull out from what you said too was, for me, like that innovation also comes from a place of creativity. Nothing in this world would exist if somebody didn't think of something, if somebody didn't ask a question and go, what if we could fly machines in the air? Okay, let's try that.
That's ridiculous. Come on. You're going to do what?
But right, like there's timeless, like, or one of my friends, this came out in a recent training I was doing this, and we were talking about this. And one of the girls, it's where I was talking about, it's like people, there's something in the human spirit, and this is what I so love, is this pioneering spirit of like, hey, I'm going to go on a wooden ship in an ocean. I think this world is flat, but let's just go to our own peril.
Even more than that, I think there are sea monsters out at the perimeter of the earth. I'm either going to get eaten by an enormous sea monster or fall off the edge. Let's do it.
But I still have to go, right? There's something in that human spirit that's like, we're still going to do this and move forward. So to me, that's like all this complexity, and yet the people who want to go safe and follow that doctrine or scripture. So, we have these two sides of, I think, human nature. And I think in a lot of ways in our own life and our own practice, we're having to do that degree of vulnerability. And so that's what I feel like going into an ocean, like searching into the world and just exploring, like we have to do that within ourselves. And I feel like that's what yoga, to me some of the heart of what yoga is. It's just doing that inner work and being okay with maybe following a path that the outside world doesn't always agree with.
I like that a lot, and I like how you brought it back around to some of the sort of gestures towards what you mean when you refer to the heart of yoga. The thing that jumps out at me in what you're saying is I think safety is one thing, right? There's a completely legitimate human need for a certain level of safety that is just part of what it is to be a living organism, right? We don't want to be in danger. And then I think there's a kind of psychologically defensive attempt to create an impression that we have the answers to certain questions and it's settled, and as long as we just stay true to what the book says or what the authority figure says, then everything's going to be okay. And in fact, that the authoritarian system that I hear you pointing towards, you were referencing patriarchy and kind of cultural conditioning. I think the authoritarian style is actually one that takes the fear of not being safe and links it to challenging the doctrine, links it to breaking the taboos, links it to ever saying that the authority figure might not have had everything completely right, and puts the fear over there and then says, okay, we can all just stay within this particular belief system where we belong and where we have a sense of a shared mission and a shared set of ideas and beliefs, and anyone else who thinks differently, they're just the enemy, or they're threatening to that sense of safety. So for me, the heart, I have a teacher training called Awakened Heart, Embodied Mind, and the heart piece in there for me is about really the psychological work and the layers of self-awareness that have to do with learning what triggers us, into being reactive, into clinging to what we think will make us safe but actually is keeping us stuck. Cultivating a kind of resilience and compassion and courage and curiosity internally, what I heard you referring to as the heart work, right? You might call it the mind work as well. So that I think that this curious, open approach mentality, a desire to explore and to discover and be creative in all these different ways, I think it's actually deeply tied to feeling a sense of security and resilience and being less pushed around by the unresolved kind of fears and traumas, we could say, that we're kind of defending against by seeking this other kind of safety that I actually think of more as, and this is my idiosyncrasy, I think of it more as a psychologically defensive kind of position. And for me, awareness practices, that should be their first order of business, is how to get past that hurdle so that an openness to life can really express itself.
Yeah, and you're right, and that's exactly it, because it's like that first layer of sense of safety. Okay, somebody else has all the answers and questions. Okay, cool, I can, boom, And you're right, and so then you have to go through that first hurdle and go, okay, vulnerability, oh shit, shoot, I don't know.
You can curse on my podcast.
Damn right I can. Thank you. Oh crap, like I've got to think for myself. Oh crap, I've got to actually look inside and do this work. But you're right, and I really, and I've felt it in my own life and practice, and wholeheartedly believe that to me, because I talk about this a lot as a container. So that's that container of self-strength and self-awareness that, we're not as swayed with other people's opinions. We're not as swayed, or we're at least more open to hearing things through the filter of our heart, hearing things through the filter. But we need to know that as an experience of who we are. And we have to do that work of who we are so that we can put ourselves, because I think this is the biggest thing of the world, of humanity right now, because I see this so often with people, is that so many people are so scared to actually be who they are, due to the stories, the experiences of their life, what they're told from teachers, from parents, or whatever. And so I think a lot of people come to a practice like yoga to uncover who they are, but then get stuck a little bit in the comfort of a tradition. But that being said, a lot of times I've seen that path too, where that's a normal path,
Yes,
okay,
sure.
Yay, comfort.
Totally.
Wait, this isn't working anymore. I have to do that. Like there's some friction here. What used to be that worked, now it's not working. What do I do now? And I feel even just, I'm going to pull this into the macro for a moment. And I really feel that same perspective is happening in the yoga world, where, we're seeing some more and more people going, what I've been taught about yoga isn't working so much anymore. Or teachers going, what I've been taught about triangle, that's not fitting the people in my class. What do I do? And then that friction point happens where it's like, but it's yoga, like, who am I to change it? Who am I to, it's this ancient tradition, blah, blah, blah. And to me, that friction point is the most exciting moment, because that's that opportunity that's telling us, that friction is saying, hey, that container that was working before needs to change or needs to evolve. But we have to go through that space of friction internally in ourselves when we look at the practice. So it's beautiful to see it in the bigger yoga world / ultimately the work of our hearts, which then is being so bold in who we are that we can put ourselves out there in the world, offer our gifts to help elevate, this is my total bias, offer our gifts to elevate humanity. So that, because for me, one of my biggest things as a teacher is like, I just want to give people permission, like permission to move well, permission to think differently, permission to be who they are. So if I'm not giving myself that permission, then I'm not being an effective teacher. And so there's a definite layer of boldness, because, putting literally, because we've met each other online in a sense, and we wouldn't have met if I hadn't, for instance, put my videos out, right?
Yep.
And I'm sure there's people who are like, who does she think she is, or blah, blah, blah. But it's like, who gives a shit, right? So but I had to come to that place doing my own inner work and building that strong container. First going through what I call my yoga existential crisis, which was a huge friction point as a teacher and a practitioner. Worked through that. And now I'm, and I'm always still working, but being in this way more clear space that it's like, you can throw arrows at me, but I don't give a shit because I believe in what I'm offering and I see a difference to the people that I'm helping. So I hope that more people can do this work of questioning, of being in that uncertainty and vulnerability, because that's where the magic is.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the big thing that I want to just highlight very quickly from what you said that I love is that the friction point is so good. Like the friction point is evidence that you're growing. The friction point is evidence that rather than just adhering to the form as the be-all, end-all, you're engaged in the heart of the experience and being honest with yourself and being unafraid to say, this works under certain conditions and not under others, or this belief actually doesn't fit for my experience of reality anymore, or this particular way of thinking about the body has turned out not to be the case in my own practice. And the commonality that I'm finding amongst the different people I've been talking to lately that you and I both know is very often there's been some kind of injury. And the injury has come as a result of staying really true to a certain perspective on how to engage with the body, how to practice yoga, and the healing or the approach to dealing with the injury has come from somewhere outside of that particular system of how we think about yoga. So that crisis, if we're brave enough, makes us go, okay, I can't deny the reality of what's happening. How do I open myself up to various streams of information without seeing them as threatening and keep evolving what I'm doing? And that's a through line I'm hearing from everyone. That's very much my story as well. I'm curious about what you're calling your yoga existential crisis was and how it came to be.
Okay, so I want to say something before I forget, because I know I'll go on to that and I'll forget this point. So one thing that I want to add on to what you're saying about that, the way I see that now, this integrated approach, to me, and I'm such a visual person, so it's like here in my head and over here, is like it's the yoga toolbox, or it's my life toolbox, or my self-care toolbox, where because everything's so complex, because I feel there are no clear black and white answers for everything and everybody and everybody, it's like rather than being like, okay, this one style is the be all and end all, it's like, well, actually there's some elements, let's say, of this one style. That's one of my tools that I'm going to pull out and apply to a specific situation. And I'm going to be curious and see if that works. And if it doesn't work, I'll try another tool. So it's a mindset shift a little bit, or a paradigm shift of rather than like, okay, I'm going to just immerse myself in a paradigm and that's all the rules within that applies to everything. Or integrated approach is, okay, I'm going to try the restorative yoga toolkit. I'm going to try, actually, you know what, maybe this biomechanic thing is, or maybe it is this kundalini. Like, who knows what it is? It doesn't matter, but you have all these tools in your toolbox. And I think it's really mature and smart rather than staying in that filter or staying into that's more of a box. And this is just this open, like, okay, I'm going to pull out my Shavasana tool now.
Yeah. And if I can interrupt you really quickly on that, I feel like it's also, it's generational. That we are part of a generation of teachers in terms of the yoga experiment in the Western world as it's existed, for the last, whatever it is, 80 years, 90 years. It really exploded about 30 years ago and 20 years ago, perhaps even more. In that whole process of being really fascinated with yoga in the ways that we are, I think there's an inevitable generational kind of maturing that happens, where for the first group of people, it's like, we went to India and we studied with this particular guru, and wow, we learned about this ancient tradition, and we're going to come back and share it because we're so passionate about it. And then there's another group who went and talked to somebody else, and they come back and they go, no, this is the way you're supposed to do it. We learned from this, and this is the real tradition. And when I was coming up in the 90s teaching yoga here in LA, there was Anna Forrest's yoga studio 2 blocks away from the original Yoga Works, well, actually the second Yoga Works on Montana Avenue, right there in Santa Monica, 2 blocks away, and we never talked to one another. It was like the Hatfields and the McCoys. They don't know what they're doing over there. You folks do all those sun salutations. You folks don't do pranayama correctly. You broke away and you have this whole different idea about psychology. Who do you think you are? And really, there was this attitude. Like I remember we had one teacher who was doing quite well, this young guy, and I talked to someone who was kind of high up at Yoga Works, and they said, yeah, we just think it's such a shame that he's throwing his career away over there with people who really don't know what they're talking about. And that's how it was. And, I'm friends with a whole group of teachers who are in their 40s right now who came up under those sorts of conditions. And I remember very clearly about 10, 15 years ago, we all started holding these events where we would teach together. We would do fundraisers and we would all be in the room together. It was like Sean Corn and Hala Curry and Ashley Turner and Micheline Berry. And we'd do these events and we would go, oh, we haven't seen this before. We haven't seen the different yoga tribes come together and go, oh, yeah, we kind of do the same stuff, and we have some interesting different kind of inflections and flavors in terms of how we're presenting things and how we're looking at things. But I think inevitably, as yoga has proliferated, you find more and more teachers who go, well, I'm going to go take a training over there, and I'm going to go take a training over there, and I really like what this approach has, and then I'm really interested in this other thing. Maybe it's Pilates, or maybe it's going and doing a dissection intensive with Gil Headley, or maybe it's getting a somatic experiencing certification or something like that. Oh, these things are really related to each other. It's actually, as I say in my classes lately, it's all one thing, man. It's all one thing. We're just coming in through different doorways and trying to make sense of it. So I think that's a huge part of it, is that we're in this generational moment where enough of us have taken a step back and gone, okay, how do I draw on these different tools that seem to be good ways of addressing specific things, and perhaps in this system they do this thing really well, but this other thing has turned out not to be that effective, and that's okay, because we don't have to be so kind of precious about our identification with the one true way. So because at the heart of it, so again, always for me, it's always coming like, what's underneath all of this? And so the heart of it is, we just want to live a good life. We just want to feel good. We like I'm talking like as humans across the board. We just want to do the best we can. And so there's so many pathways to achieving that, and that it's like yoga's not the be all and end all, but yet it is, because depending on how you want to define yoga. So I know that's so fascinating, hey, that even the yoga, like I believe me, I know the dramatics over the years of different yoga styles, studios. It's just it's a fascinating phenomena, but at the same time completely unsurprising, because we're human. Again, like we're so like, oh, I'm doing my inner work, and oh, my yoga's working, but that yoga's not. Like, and I've been there. I've been a yoga princess where I was like, that style is what. And so now I'm just at this place where actually I often keep coming back to the Wicca. There's a Wiccan saying, I think, which is, do what you will as long as it harms none. And I kind of love that in regards to this, because then it's like, do whatever you want. If it's not hurting anybody, then cool. Then it gives, like, there's that freedom and permission again, going, okay. Because for me, I'm a beautifully complex, unique person who's always evolving and growing. And what worked for me last week might not work for me next week in 5 years. And I don't want to keep pushing myself down to fit into that box when the essence of life is creativity and exploration and imagination. So I want to be able to stay open. Okay, so the yoga existential crisis, that was a number of years ago. That probably kind of started for me around well, in a way, like I owned a yoga studio back in like 2004 and then sold that in 2007. And I feel like getting really burnt out after that in 2007 was maybe the precipice of that existential crisis. But it really came to a head kind of 2011, where I was like, so I have a 7-year-old son. And so I had just had him for a year, started to get back into teaching again, and was like,
starting to teach, and I wanted to progress my career forward, but I was like, well, I'm not interested in teaching gigantic, like that, the world of like the Wanderlust festivals, like that, or, especially at that time, there was all the, like, and there still is, but that predominance of like one-armed handstands and all the like none of that was what I wanted. But I felt like, oh, if I want to progress my career, I'm going to have to start like posting pictures of me doing handstands and and I'm not interested in that. And then, of course, as a teacher going, wait, okay, and none, like what I've been taught isn't fitting into what's actually happening in my classes, into the people who are walking into the room. My intention of a teacher is to help people, right? To help them to move well, to feel well, to get them to know themselves better. And these cues that I was just saying by rote just weren't fitting anymore. So I had this thing where I was like intuitively I knew something wasn't right, or intuitively I knew that XQ was not appropriate, but I didn't know why. I didn't know, I couldn't tell. And it didn't really jive with me to go, I feel like this is not right. Like I needed more backup. So part of my existential crisis, or what started to move me forward out of that, was to like leave the yoga world in terms of training. I've actually done more training outside of yoga than I actually have within yoga. Because that's where it was like, I'm like, oh, well, my 200 hour was grossly inadequate back in 2003. Like that was early days in a lot of sense.
Yeah.
For trainings and quality of trainings compared to now, I think. And so I just had to learn more about the body. And once I got that scientific information and validation for my intuition, so the things that I intuited going, hey, this isn't right, and now I can back it up with science. Then I was able to come back to yoga and come back to teaching and go, okay, cool. So now let's change this cue. Let's do this slightly different because blah, blah, blah. And then trust that that's actually enhancing the practice.
Yes.
So even if it looks different, it's still yoga,
Absolutely. Well, I mean, this in a way, this is a very important distinction that I hear you talking about in there. And it's hard to talk about this without sounding nerdy and kind of pseudo-intellectual, but it comes down to what in philosophy is called epistemology, right? So how do we know what we know, and on what basis are we making claims of knowledge in different domains, right? And so when you start off the whole conversation talking about heart and bones, puppy, calm down. Baby, it's okay. When you start off the whole conversation talking about heart and bones, and the bones part being, anatomy, and maybe the heart part, just for oversimplification, the heart part being inner work, I think we get into this unavoidable kind of place that nonetheless, very often I think we want to avoid, about really, really thinking carefully about what our different knowledge claims are based on, and what the different domains are really about. And I think there's a really interesting difference between a kind of laissez-faire, eclectic, kind of wishy-washy place of like, oh yeah, man, it's all cool and it's all interesting and it's all valid, right? Like a kind of postmodern relativism where it's like, well, that's your truth and this is my truth. My truth is if you do triangle this way, intuitively, I just have this higher knowing, right? There's a big difference between that and a genuinely integrative mindset where we're saying, let's actually look at each of these knowledge claims on their own terms. So here's this knowledge claim about meditation that says, if you practice these particular techniques, these are the types of experiences that show up. And you can engage in that experimental process and find out for yourself. And then there's the more tricky question of what do those experiences represent and how shall we interpret them? That now you start to really get into some territory that I think is tough to break down. But when we're talking about the body, the types of experiments that we're engaging in actually have empirical reference points. And I heard you say, I got to this point where I was feeling in this existential crisis that certain things really weren't working anymore. So I went and I looked at the science. And I looked at scientific ways of trying to understand the body and found, here's something that validates something that I was already experiencing or feeling. And I'm sure you found other things that where you were like, oh, this forces me to rethink something else that I thought was true or that I had been taught was true.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and so this process of really integrating an experiential, like a reverence for and a love of experiential inner work, and at the same time a very grounded kind of scientific attitude to how we make claims about the body, and how we understand that's always in process, right? And a lot of people who are kind of anti-science will say, well, science is continuously changing its mind. How are we supposed to know? They used to say this and now they say that. It's like, yes, that's what's so awesome about it. You change your beliefs based on what the data shows, and then if the data shows you something else, you go, I guess we were wrong. Here's now what we're seeing. We don't know what's going to happen next, but that doesn't mean we just have a wishy-washy attitude where we go, well, none of it is really knowable, and so whatever you think flies, right?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I think that is the crux of this all. I think that you raise a really, really good point. And that's why, again, maybe in a lot of ways for a lot of people, this is that harder path, because that's a really, like, you've got to work on that balance between like certainty and uncertainty. And we want safe, again, back to that sense of safety in answers. Sure. And yet being open to evolving and changing, so that really, like, it's almost counterintuitive. It's almost contradictory sounding, right? It's like validity, science, as you said, like empirical evidence, intuition, feeling, and how do you navigate both of those worlds? But I think that is where this is where we're at right now. And this is the crux of the matter, is like being able to, and then going back to what I was saying about that container, being strong enough in who we are to be okay with changing our minds.
Yep.
This is just, everything is always in evolution. Everything always really is in progress and in process. And I think that in of itself is a friction point, right?
Yes.
So back to another, again, like that sense of that friction point. But I think that, and being okay with that, and being okay with that beautiful balance, hopefully, of certainty, uncertainty, because I think when we can take it into the bigger picture and keep framing it as exploration, curiosity, then it gives that permission to make mistakes. It gives that permission to think differently, to question how we used to think, and know that none of it is wrong. I think back to my early classes that look a lot different than they do now. Did I hurt anybody back then? Hopefully not, but so even with my bad cueing or my, because again, 16 years ago, things were totally different. People still walked away benefiting from those classes.
Yes.
So it's, again, I think it's being comfortable with complexity, being comfortable with uncertainty. And that's what I really feel a good, like, our practice can teach us that. Yoga gives us the tools and the capacity to live with uncertainty, because that is the nature of life, in my opinion. When is anything certain? Our health? Our life expectancy, everything is uncertain. So which then again I would pull back and go, no wonder people want the answers. No wonder people want dogma. Yeah. Because inherently being human is being uncertain.
Yeah, and this takes me back to this sort of reflection on the Western yoga experiment, and I feel like there's a very interesting irony in there, which is that I think that the embrace of yoga and the real fascination with yoga in the West comes out of the 60s counterculture. It comes out of a group of people who were saying, we reject our parents' way of doing things. We regret 1950s Leave It to Beaver, rigid gender roles, shame about sexuality, being uncomfortable with your body. We reject all of this religious dogmatism that has been part of what the people before us were invested in and restricted by. And for me, I grew up in South Africa, and I was a teenager in the 80s, and we were so identified with the 60s American counterculture because so many things were similar. We had a war that we were fighting in a country outside of our own, and there was a draft. I was a conscientious objector. I was playing in a protest rock and roll band. There were all of these really interesting parallels, and the civil rights struggle in America really, for me, mirrored the fight to end apartheid in South Africa, perhaps even more intense in South Africa. So I was very identified with that, and I had the same kind of irreverence toward authority that I think really is at the heart of saying, of having this absolutely culturally unique moment where a whole group of people say, we're going to reject the spirituality, essentially, the religion of our particular culture, and go and explore something that comes from another place because it feels more exciting, it feels more interesting, it feels more alive, it feels less kind of rigid and obligatory, right? Lacking in the ritual juice and the transformational process. And I honestly, I think a lot of that comes from psychedelics, and there's a whole interesting kind of relationship between altered states that people were experiencing at that time and what is at the heart of the yoga tradition if you go far enough back in time, and even still to this day, there's a lot of that going on. So there's this huge irony there for me that an impulse towards something so radically open, so radically rejecting of authoritarian dogma and traditionalist kind of restriction can then become its own new rigid. I have found, and not only that, but it is like so thoroughly patriarchal, to come back to the word that you mentioned earlier. It's so thoroughly patriarchal to say there is this male authority figure and he knows everything about the world beyond and the practices that you can do to realize it and the true meaning of life, and if you just follow what he said, then everything is going to be great. Like, how is that a rebellious counterculture, bold new way? It's like, no, you've stepped in that direction, and then you've kind of regressed back into this desire for safety and certainty and authority. So I just find that to be really fascinating, and I think that there's an interesting metaphysical piece, and we don't have to go too deeply into this, but to me, there's a real distinction between what I see as a more Buddhist metaphysics that really embraces uncertainty, that really says everything is in a state of flux, everything is changing. Get comfortable with that, because you may as well, because that's reality. The way it is. So figure out how to get comfortable with that, and know that there's nothing to hold on to, and use these awareness tools to kind of deal with it, right?
Bingo.
As opposed to actually a more dualist metaphysics that says, root yourself in this one thing that is certain, this true self that transcends the material world, and know that all of this is an illusion and it will pass, and you will be safe in your transcendent kind of immortal soul. To me, that's actually really key. I know a lot of people will not agree, but
I agree. Yeah. No, I think that, because to me, so I've shared this in the past before in other interviews, but it's like years ago I did a cadaver dissection course with Thomas Myers. Amazing,
Lucky.
right? 5 days. That's its own other amazing conversation. Yeah. But one thing that I want to pull out from that is that the mantra, the words that kept coming, because it was truly one of the most profound experiences I've ever had. I've been to ashrams, I've done all the like traditional kind of stuff, but it was like cutting open the human body, that was profound. And so speaking to that sense of that dualistic, you are not this body, this is all like transcend. What came out of that was like, who are we if we're not this body? So going back to what I was saying earlier about that, like this life is so beautifully precious. This life is all I've got right now. Why would I not be fully in it and transcend it? It's weird and it's crazy. But I also love that you brought up that the correlation between apartheid and the counterculture revolution, because again, it goes back to that sense we are not independent of the cultural conditioning. And I think it's beautiful. And I think it's also hilarious too, that you pointed out that it was all like, yay. And then like turning in, like going back to that sense of safety. And I've seen that over and over and over. And I think, and yoga in no way is immune to that. So yeah, it's fascinating times. It's really interesting. And I think the more of us that can be boldly moving forward and saying, hey, here's what I was going to say. It's something that you said about that. To me, I always relate this to like that sort of like, okay, well, this hasn't worked, screw you, blah, blah. Like, to me, that's like, I see that as like the in terms of personal growth and evolution, that's like the teenage rebellion years. I was that, right? Like, fuck you, mom and dad, you don't know me. Well, you should read my teen angst poetry, right? So there's that sense of, I'm rejecting everything that I thought was to be true. And I think then what happens is then we start to hopefully, rather than going back to that same safety net after you've rejected it, the next maturing of that is, you're not in your teen years anymore. So in our spiritual self-growth, let's say, moving past those teen years, going into that sense of maturing and going into that sense of adulthood. So our yoga practice maybe starts to become more compassionate, more accepting of all the dualities, and more embracing of again, what you were saying about the Buddhist perspective of just, it's all uncertain. So just work with it. Because that creates the freedom. That creates the richness of humanity and life that we're all searching for. But you have to go, so back to that sense of friction, we have to go and do our work, I feel. And so, and anchor that work in the experience of our bodies.
Yeah. So I love that. It's true to my experience too, that there's a crossing over of a threshold into a really compassionate self-embrace, and an embrace of the body, an embrace of the psyche, an embrace of all vulnerability, and therefore an embrace of others in all of those same ways. And with that kind of gentle container, I think then each of the different tools that are about awareness or strength or range of motion or what have you, healing, they can be applied always sort of relating back to that keynote of compassionate embrace. This is the only journey I'm on. This is my one precious body. These are things I say in my classes all the time. This is the only journey I'm on. This is my one precious body. This is the state of my mind, the condition of my heart today, as I find myself turning inward and being curious. And whatever is showing up is valid and relevant. It's not in the way of some idealized experience I'm supposed to be having. It actually is the way, as I sort of stay with my phenomenology of, this is how it is to be human, and these are the ways in which I get reactive, and this is what I'm scared of, and this is what's happening in my life right now that I have no control over. Regardless of like who my teacher is, or what my belief system is, or what book I read yesterday, these are still the things I have no control over. How do I meet myself at that what I heard you referring to as that really kind of tense friction place?
Yeah. And that's the gold. I think if we could just highlight this chunk of it, all of this has been so great, but like especially I think this is where we're really getting into the heart and the meat of what I feel so passionate about, because I also see too within this renaissance of like, okay, cool, now here's all the new mobility techniques. Now everybody check this, and this is this new cue. There's almost, and I'm watching this happen, and I'm kind of, it's interesting to see. I want to point out that like that in of itself becomes a new dogma, right? So like, because at the heart, so I think that going like, but now, okay, no. Now this is the only way to mobilize your hip joints, because science is saying this and like, and yeah, but no, because science does evolve. But sure, this new technique's great, but let's not get stuck on that either. Because why do we care about a new technique? Why do we want to learn more? So that we can have a more helpful, healthy toolbox so that we can do this work. It's not just about what does my shoulder joint do and need. Although I love it and I geek out on it. And, we could have spent a whole conversation talking about that. But blah, blah, blah. Because really at the end of the day, I want to move my body well. So I have the emotional and physical capacity to do this work. To me, that's like the heart work, and the heart work is what feeds my cells just as much as the movement.
Absolutely. That's lovely. And there's a piece in there too of the kind of biopsychosocial component as well, right? Which is that these things are really influencing one another in inextricable ways. So my capacity to be compassionate to myself may be directly related to how I experience my myofascial pain, or what's happening in that joint, and it may even, and vice versa, how I'm able to move well and have proprioceptive, somatic awareness, has a direct impact on my mood and my resilience and my capacity to deal with something that is emotionally painful from a place of feeling grounded in myself.
Yeah.
So how we keep weaving those threads, I think, is so important.
I think it's key because it's not, because again, this new information can end up replacing the old information and keeping us in a cycle of fixing or a cycle of, to me, I'm always so interested in the questions underneath the questions. So is it like, okay, what's the new thing that I can do for my shoulder joint? Or why has my shoulder joint not improved its mobility in 10 years of yoga or something like this, But it's like, to me, the question underneath that is I hear, I'm not good enough. I've been doing yoga for 10 years and my body hasn't changed. Something's wrong with me. So that's the magic. That's, again, that's that friction point in the work that it's like, okay, sure, we can go and address some specific things. And here's 10 things that you can do to actually improve because maybe what you were doing in your shoulder wasn't effective. So here's some other techniques. But also not forgetting that, well, why do I feel like I'm not enough? Why do I feel like I'm a better yogi if I can do a one-armed handstand or if I can put my head on my knees, or toes or whatever, like all the, but that's a lot of work. And I think so many people are just like, oh my God, just give me down dog and shut up. And that's fine too.
Sure. Yeah, well, I think that's a really good place to stop for now. Is you're coming back around to this idea of staying curious about the questions that are beneath the questions. I like that a lot. I like that attitude of inquiry.
Yeah.
I have a feeling we'll do more of these conversations. Thank you so much for
You're
being
welcome.
here today, Brea. Yeah.
So good.
Yeah.